we've heard about the evolving threat landscape and how security strategies need to adapt to reflect that evolution. Now we'd like to open up the debate and hear from the people who can offer frontline insight on these and other issues. I'm joined by Juan and also by Duncan Brown from IDC, Toon from Pinsent Masons and Rod Clayton from Shandwick. So first question we've had in, I'd like to ask is, can you ever really fix the human problem? A controversial question because obviously it does assume that the human is a problem. Anyone want to kick off on this one?
Sure. So I think the short answer is probably not, but I think we can try harder. The way in which we address the problem too often is it's a technology problem solved by technology, and that's part of the solution. But increasingly, we have to educate and encourage our end users, anyone that comes in contact with data, sensitive data, or valuable data. That is part of their responsibility, I think, to do that. So it's a constant reminder that we're all essentially on the hook for this.
Christian, you've been CISO for a number of organisations. You've had a great deal of experience in this. Do you get the impression that for employees, for staff, it's just always the techie's problem to fix?
I think partly yes, but it's not a technology problem they need to fix. The technology teams need to be better at communicating, and the whole education and awareness that Duncan sort of mentioned there is we need to be better at that. Humans aren't perfect, okay? It's kind of the way it's going to be, but we should be a lot better at delivering understanding, awareness and education to the team so they know what they're dealing with. It's not just the technology needs to fix it. We need to be better at explaining why it is we're getting them to do what they're doing.
I mean, the depressing one I often hear about is phishing campaigns. You know, people send out a phishing campaign, you get a 30% click-through rate, you do an education campaign off the back of it, and then you do it again and you maybe get a 35% failure rate. Those sort of things, are they just a blunt tool? Is there anything we can do to help them, improve them?
They can be a blunt tool if they're used incorrectly, like that example. What's really key is actually we're looking at behaviours of the people, the individuals associated to the organisation, access to the information, and it's about kind of working out how to engage those individuals. There isn't a one-size solution that fits all. We don't pay everybody the same, so we shouldn't treat everybody the same. Everyone's got different pressure points.
I think sometimes the approach that companies take, it's like a Sheepdip approach. You dunk your users in, swirl them around and pull them back out, and then they don't get training again for 6 months or maybe even a year, by which time they've forgotten all that they may have learned. We need to move to a much more constant sense of vigilance, that all users are responsible all the time, and to think about this of continuous improvement, continuous reinforcement of good behaviours.
Well, this may be one for you. I find this interesting. Much is said about organisations going public too late after an incident. Can you name any examples where someone may have gone public too soon?
Well,
it's a risk, you know?
I think the risk is naming people and getting it wrong. So I'm not sure I'm going to do that. But I think certainly there are examples of people going public with information too soon, which I realise is not necessarily exactly the question being asked, but I think is related. You certainly can go public too soon in the sense that you may think you have some regulatory requirement that you don't have, and you could also cause people unnecessary concern and unnecessary fear. So I do think you could go too soon in that way. And you can also go too soon in terms of the volume of information that you provide or the nature of the information you provide. For example, we have seen cases where people say that, X number have been affected of their consumers, and in fact it's a tiny fraction of that. So again, you certainly don't want to be giving information until you know it to be absolutely true.
Well, you're not going to say it, but I am. The TalkTalk is an interesting example here, isn't it? In that there's two ways to look at TalkTalk. It was a responsible decision to go and inform your customers and say up to 4 million, I think it was at the time, could be affected. Obviously later on it turns out to be less. Other people might say, well, hang on, why didn't you hold your fire until you knew the actual figure? So companies are sort of walking this line, aren't they, at the moment, between those two things?
Yeah, I think in all kinds of issues, not just these, it is fairly axiomatic that you don't give information until you know it. I mean, the same would be true, for example, with fatalities in an accident. You don't guess at the number affected because you certainly don't guess that there's been one when there hasn't been one. People can be devastated by just hearing that, and obviously there might be happier news at the end of it, but it's still not a good thing. And of course also people will give too low a number sometimes. So I think it's a fundamental, don't give something as a fact unless you are certain that it is the fact.
I mean, we're facing new rules on this, aren't we? GDPR is going to come in. Certain types of information you've got to report within, I think it's 72 hours to the Information Authority, the Data Protection Authority. There's a couple of questions there. Number one, can you do that? And number two, do you know what's gone? How many companies, in your experience, you guys would actually be able to know within 72 hours? Okay, this is what went missing. This is what we're going to report.
But I don't think they're not looking for that level of detail. What they're looking for is just the notification that something's gone wrong, and they want to know about the plan.
There are already laws in some jurisdictions for reporting much sooner than that, actually.
But it is the moment of truth, right? So that's the point at which the regulator is looking very, very closely at you, and it's going to measure how you respond in terms of any action that it may take as a consequence of that. So, if you say, we think we've had an incident, we've no idea what's going on. In fact, someone else told us rather than us finding it. That's not a good position to be in. If you're able to say, we think we've had an incident, we don't have all the details, we'll get back to you. Regulators are fine with that kind of thing. But they want to know that you're in control. And going back to the TalkTalk incident, I think the overall learning of that episode was that you got a sense that they were kind of making it up as they went along. They didn't really have an overall plan. They hadn't thought ahead of what their incident response program would be, and so they were kind of caught in the headlights, and which then leads to that kind of over disclosure. Which they then had to revise over a period of time. So, think ahead.
I think regulators, of course, want you to be to err on the side of communicating, because to them that helps make them look useful as well. And so it's easily understood why that provision's there. Of course, again, some organizations do have other obligations as well that they need to balance with that. So there will always, I think, still be business for lawyers in terms of determining what exactly it is that you are supposed to report, if anything, within those 72 hours.
Lawyers win in the end.
Always win.
One for Juan, I think this one. Be kind on this question. How often should an organisation perform a complete threat protection test? Obviously, your ideal answer is going to be constantly and always, but take into account that might
actually
not be possible.
No. So a theme, even with the last question, and I was kind of oddly quiet, as sort of letting everybody have their go, because I think people have heard enough from me today. But a theme with this is this oversimplification of the nature of an institution and the nature of an attack. So going back to the previous question, the notion of data protection, especially when you have consumer data, of course, it's great that regulators are getting involved and to a certain extent and sort of standing up for consumer interests and saying, hey, you should probably let them know that something's wrong. But it does assume that cyber attacks always have the same end, and that there's always an interest in that particular type of data, and that it's always going to be breached in that kind of actionable way that matters for consumer protection agencies, versus saying, for example, breaching a company, possibly like TalkTalk or an ISP or a software developer, for the purposes of stealing intellectual property or affecting what the product is itself or affecting what's coming down the pipeline. And the solution isn't always you need to go tell everybody out there. So not to speak against consumer interests, but to say cyber attacks aren't always exactly the same and they don't always operate in the same way. So going back to this question of how often you should do this kind of assessment, I think what bothers me about the question, nothing against the person asking in any way, but I'd like to essentially make a distinction with whether what you really need is constant external assessments as much as an internal process to do something with that information. I mean, it happens very often that we will approach institutions and say, hey, you've got a very big problem. And this is all the information that you need to know, and we'll do so freely. We'll in the process of remediating something, the last thing we want is to hold somebody for ransom for information that they need. So you say, this is all the information that you need, and the company representatives will stare at you blankly because it's an issue so many orders of magnitude beyond what they're prepared to address that they can't do anything with that.
Is that because you're addressing the wrong altitude of the business, if you like? If you get into the boardroom, if you get into the senior management, are you talking to the right people when you say you have that kind of response? Somebody in the food chain must be high enough up.
We shouldn't assume that every enterprise is ready to handle their IT problems at every level. I think that's part of the issue there. We're seeing it much more commonly, much more prevalently, because so many institutions across so many different verticals are now holding on to consumer data. So they have another thing to protect that they might not have otherwise. Before, if you were a toy manufacturer, you would have never had to worry about having the data of a bunch of children. Now, because your doll is connected to the internet and collecting and recording, all of a sudden we have to worry about whether you're disclosing information about 6-year-olds to the wrong kind of people.
Just on that point about customer data, we had an interesting, sort of fairly direct question actually. When one's data is breached, what's the first thing a CISO should do? And that's coming to you, Christian. Do you have a checklist that you go through you want to share with us?
Somebody famously once told me I used to carry 3 envelopes around, but I guess it's a hard one because each event's going to be different. For me, it's more around notification, but internally first, because I need to kind of mobilise and inform the relevant parties, and it's through that notification internally that I'll go through a process of validating the breach in the first instance and scoping it out. Because me running upstairs and going, "Hey, we've been hacked," the first question is, "Well,
yes.
What? What do you mean?
Yeah,
What's gone? What's the silence gaze on it?" So the idea is we kind of quantify it first. And then start to mobilise our plans for dealing with this sort of thing.
And how quickly do you in that sort of chain of reporting and the kind of unfolding sequence of events, how quickly does something like communications come into it? Are they involved fairly early on?
Pretty much first or second call, yeah. Because if it's not internal communications, it's going to be external communications. How we want to be perceived as a brand, to our clients, to the market, etc., as well as how our duty of care extends to our employees as well. Because as far as they might see it, their organisation's just been targeted, and if it is as large as some of the events we've seen lately, then their kind of job security will start coming into it, and they get a bit worried.
Rod, is that common that they would be fairly high up on the list, or are companies still sort of thinking this is a tech problem?
Music to my ears, they certainly should be, and often they are. But I think a couple of things. First of all, Christian talked earlier about internal communications, and certainly a lot of companies could do a lot more earlier in terms of employee communication, but also considering how they communicate with consumers or whoever on the outside so that they handle their own data better. That's a very emerging area that is fraught with difficulty, but is important to think about ahead of time. And then also on the back end, after things have happened, it does go into operation, but it still doesn't mean it always works. And I think you were talking about how far down the chain. I mean, if you look at Equifax and you have some presumably an employee or a communications person of some type tweeting a response to someone asking, how do I get my information blocked? And the link is not to Equifax's actual site, but in fact to a phishing site, because they flip the words around, I guess. That's most unfortunate, and you feel for the person making the mistake, but it's also indicative, I think, of how much you need to think about and the details of execution as well as the strategy.
It's true, and Alessio made a really good point about this. It's something I hadn't thought about, that if you've been breached, you probably lost control of your internal communication systems. He raised the idea of having a separate set of systems you can rely on, a backup communication system, both internally for your staff, but also externally for your users, your customers.
Yes, we have a thing called Mobile Command that is a separate system. So if your system's down, you still are able to communicate as a communications team. That's obviously what it's for. But I think it's highly sensible, and I think a lot of more seriously organized companies do have that. Of course, one of the things, to pick up on something Juan was saying about, it's interesting with the regulators as well, they tend to think about the larger organizations. And I think the tough thing is, if you're a small company, how do you deal with these things? Now, GDPR obviously doesn't affect very small companies. There is a threshold, but nevertheless, the expectations that are put on smaller firms are ever greater in all sorts of ways, and that can be, the practical realities for those firms can be quite difficult.
There's a question we have here, which how do you determine what is an appropriate response to a given incident? And that it's a difficult question to answer, but fundamentally that is a really important question to answer, isn't it? How do you,
Well, it's the question that you'll get from your board. How bad is it? Yeah, and again, it's back to this incident response cycle of trying to have a plan in place for assessing how bad it is, but also being able to adjust that assessment as you go along. Example of a company in the Netherlands a couple of years ago, it took them a week to find out that they had not been breached. because there was data exposed, and it appeared to come from them, and they were questioned by the regulator and their customers, and the media was all over them, and they still don't quite know what's. And it took them 7 days to find out that actually it wasn't them; it was someone else that had leaked data that just looked suspicious.
Because you have credential stuffing where credentials have been leaked elsewhere, but then used against customers of another service.
Absolutely, exactly so, exactly so. And so you've got to be prepared to say something. But again, what you were saying, Rod, earlier about having incremental releases of information, both to the media and also to the regulator. Regulators are absolutely happy with that. There's a misperception, I think, that sometimes you have to give all the information to the regulator within that 72-hour period under GDPR. Absolutely not the case. Regulators are quite happy to have a drip feed, as long as they get the sense that you're in control. Now, media sometimes works to different standards, different expectations, and that's why we need professionals to mediate that. So maybe you have at least two programs. One to the regulator, one to the media, and maybe a third to the actual data subjects whose data is under threat.
It's interesting. I find journalists increasingly asking, "Did you report to the ICO? When did you report to the ICO?" For the UK Information Commissioner's Office, the data watchdog for the UK, and I find that interesting because journalists are getting the hang of, well, this is a stick that we can beat with people with. There's an interesting one here. How do you? What do you tell your clients and the government if you are unsure about the extent of the breach? We've been talking about this a bit, but I wonder if we can answer that question particularly.
Well, I think at the heart of any response, you kind of owe it to your shareholders, stakeholders, your clients and customers to be just honest and be purposeful with where you are.
But what if the honest answer, sorry to interrupt, but what if the honest answer is we don't know? That's a risky answer to give, no?
It is, but I think we've seen in a number of breach responses that have gone so wrong, they are just lacking empathy, and people get really angry because they're just seen as this kind of big corporate machine that just doesn't care. But actually, the reality is they probably don't know. I mean, on the telco example with TalkTalk, I think I read somewhere it took them like 10 days from point of notification and kind of media circus to actually finding out what had gone wrong. And the main decision behind the mass notification was they saw it in their eyes. They were trying to do the right thing by their consumer base. Now, I'm not, whole response was fraught with errors, but that business decision to say, I want to put my customer first, and if that was me, I'd want to know if I was at risk. So they told everyone.
Yes, yeah.
And I think the same thing goes here, for organisations to demonstrate empathy and leadership when dealing with this. I don't think it's that hard.
But the fascinating thing is people sometimes find it very hard to say, I don't know. And the media are very good at making people feel bad when they say, I don't know. But I agree, it is often the truthful answer and could well be the best answer. But it's difficult for people sometimes to actually put that into practice.
What I find interesting, if you don't mind me jumping in, is there seems to be a particular fascination or perhaps even forgivingness when it comes to being able to determine scope. So it's one thing to say, hey, we don't know, or we're working on it and so on. What I find essentially starts to create some comfort and maybe take it away eventually is when institutions are at least able to say, hey, this affects our customer database, but it doesn't affect our service, or it doesn't affect our product, or it does affect certain types of things. And what seems to be kind of a cardinal sin is to then provide that sense of scope and eventually have to correct it. To say this doesn't affect our customer database, and then 3 days later a lot of customer information leaks out and you go, actually it does affect our customer, but only this part of it. Oh no, so you start to get this incremental release, but in the worst possible way.
And it's tricky that, isn't it? Because again, you're walking this line between informing people of what you know at the time, but then being held to it later on. And we've seen this, haven't we, Juan, with some certain hacktivist groups as well. If hacktivism is still a term that's in currency, but the idea of selective leaking, almost editorialized leaking. I leak this today to cause the company pain here, and as they scramble to get over that, I leak this bit over here. We're seeing more and more of that kind of behavior, are we not?
We're seeing a whole lot of that, and it's sort of this painful sort of Chinese torture, if you will, just like drip, drip, drip. The other side of it that I'm particularly curious about, since I don't have to do the remediation on the part of a particular company, so I kind of get to be the dark cloud that says this is wrong, and then you just kind of keep floating. But something like the Sony situation, which was this perfect confluence of everything terrible that you could possibly hope to happen in one of those incidents. You have a sabotage operation that takes down all of your networks. You don't have an alternate means of communication, so people are going back to using their Gmail accounts and sort of personal accounts. All of their own employee information is leaking out. At the same time, you've got responsibility to stakeholders, not just the people that work for you and consumers, but for example, movies and multi-million-dollar projects that are suddenly starting to leak out. All the while, the attacker is actually saying, hey, we've got more. Pay us this much, or do this, or change that, and then we won't. So there was proof that there had been a certain amount of negotiating back and forth that went wrong in the first couple of days, and not necessarily taking the threat that seriously. So at the end, you have this perfect storm of disarray within the company, without the company, outside of the company, in the government. It was I think one of the bigger crisis scenarios that you could envision for an institution. So if anything, our conversations about data breaches, they're sort of top of mind right now, but they almost seem forgiving in comparison to how a lot of these situations can actually go down.
Just from a tech point of view, to what extent do you think it's possible within an organization to start siloing information? So in something like Sony, obviously you get owned with a capital O or capital P, depending on how you spell it, and everything leaks out. Could that have been prevented, for example, by better data siloing? Is that possible? Something you discuss with customers?
Network segmentation is one of the absolute pillars of how a network's architecture is supposed to be designed. I think part of the problem here is that technology has become rolled into and essentially primary and essential to the functioning of almost every single vertical and every single sector, but most companies are not technology companies. So technology becomes a part of your functioning, and you sort of just take it in stride and keep running with it. But seldom has an institution actually stopped its operations or even stopped before it started and said, this is how we're going to design our infrastructure, this is how we're going to give purview and ability for a CISO or whomever is actually architecting this product to say, listen, we need to actually stop operations for X amount of time or contain them in this sort of way so that they function in a certain way.
I was going to ask Christian, is that your experience in organisations
in the utopian one that I've never quite got to? I think I totally agree with the point, is that's kind of the approach we should be taking, but I guess that the challenge is legacy and history. The organisations that exist today have probably gone through 50 or 60 different acquisitions or mergers over the years, and the infrastructure's just been bolted together because it's not been a priority. So now we find ourselves with legacy systems, flat networks, or kind of interconnected networks that don't or aren't afforded the kind of siloed controls.
So one thing that Alessio said in his presentation was, security needs to be an enabler of business, and so often it is a disabler of business. It gets in the way because it's not designed in from what you were saying, Juan, about think about these things at the beginning of putting a network together rather than thinking about right at the end if you ever get there. Right. We need to be much better at building security and consideration of security, whether it's network design or whether it's training or data protection or anything. Because if you think about it later, you're always going to be catching up, and that's never a good position to be.
You might be able to help on this next question then. Can the panel advise on the balance between security and privacy and productivity? It's been a challenge.
So this is the key question, isn't it? And when we talk about GDPR or just general good business hygiene, that is the business decision. So it's a risk-based, hopefully an informed decision to make between the utility of data, of flat networks, of productivity, and being secure, and each business has got to make that decision. I think it'd be interesting to get Juan's comment on this. I think the security industry, both from a vendor and from a practitioner point of view, we've not been very good at articulating that risk in terms that business can understand and can act upon. So we talk about risk in terms of the technology and vulnerabilities and all that kind of stuff. And the business, whether it's a CEO or a CFO or someone else thinking, yeah, but what does that mean? Are we is this how is this going to affect our share price or all that kind of stuff. So we've not been very good at articulating that, and we need to get much better at it.
It's interesting. I attended a sort of wargaming exercise the other day, which is fascinating. Really well done exercise, and they had all these sort of metrics of you're getting hit in this way. How do you defend yourself? Here's your Twitter feed and so on. And the one thing they didn't have on their unfolding scenario was the share price. And I felt that was a big missing factor that will really motivate people when you see your share price at a tank.
And also reputation, not only of the corporate, but of the individual board members or the senior positions, because we know now that if you get a major breach, then your own personal career prospects are going to be severely limited.
Well, Equifax is
well, there you go. And even go back to TalkTalk, but there's a residual sort of cloud that hangs over it, and of the individuals that were at the helm at the time. Their personal reputations, I think, have taken a dent as well. So we're all on the hook for this. Yeah.
Just bringing it around, do you see that progression through from here are the risks, here are the threats? Do you see that going up the sort of corporate food chain, as it were, in terms that Duncan's talking about, where people can understand higher up, look, this is the risk?
To be perfectly honest, from a technologist standpoint, I'm actually disappointed at how manageable these incidents are, insofar as it's easy to sacrifice a couple of board members or a CEO, CSO, and move on. And the reason that I care about that is, fine, it's a shame for executives to, from one day to the next, you get to your business and it turns out you don't have a job anymore because of something you were probably not even aware of. Whether that's your fault or not is something to be discussed in post-mortem. But at the end of the day, what's actually happening on a wider landscape is we're getting to a point where identity is becoming an issue online. And all these industries are becoming so much more open and have enabled e-commerce to exist in a way that I think is financially exciting for the world as a whole. And yet the primary issue, the whole cornerstone of how that can work, which is identity at a distance, is becoming dissolved. So what happens when you have, I'm from the United States, you have databases out there of 150 million people, social security numbers, credit card numbers, addresses. What do you start to use to be able to identify your customers? What happens, I was talking in a financial event a couple of days ago, and these people are wide-eyed looking at me going, well, how do we actually know who is who online? How do you provide them? People want privacy. They don't want any kind of overbearing data collection. And at the same time, all of their personally identifiable information is out there. So I have some limited sympathy for the kind of executives that are getting put on the chopping block. But the effects of a breach like Equifax or some other giant breach of personally identifiable information are actually much more widespread. We're going to have a problem in a couple of years where we say everybody in the United States has been breached at one point or another.
And
what do you do?
I think that's the worry. I think at the moment we're not seeing the bigger picture. Frankly, most people, when a big breach happens, they might notice it, they might clock it in the news, but I don't think they might not change their passwords, they certainly wouldn't try and focus on that information. And it's interesting the point you make, there's got to be an effect long term, hasn't there? The more and more institutions that get breached, the more and more passwords that get out there, the more and more criteria that get leaked, credentials that get leaked, it's going to have an effect, right? It's got to.
Just make the passwords longer.
Yes, solve all our problems.
People are blasé about it. I think, Juan mentioned, of course, there are certain areas where they're not. So Juan mentioned with children's things, and of course the VTech thing, that was people very upset about that. I thought it was interesting that their efforts to push back on the consumer obviously backfired spectacularly, but there is something somewhere about, I think, about how consumers share information in the future and what their awareness is of the risk they're taking. I think the last Private Eye, there was a cartoon of English Satirical Magazine cartoon of someone just checking the box to the statement, I have not bothered to read this, because it's far too long, check. And, that's the reality. So people are agreeing to things without even reading them. Even lawyers won't necessarily read or understand some of these things. And it's a big problem.
So the terms of service in your average app is longer than Hamlet, right? So, I mean, there is a genuine problem here.
And less interesting, amazing.
That's a matter of opinion, I guess. We were talking about GDPR earlier, and I think this is really interesting because the first wave of impact on GDPR is to change the behavior of businesses that gather personal data, to make them think much earlier about how they should treat this data. I think the second wave of impact is going to be on us as consumers, that we realize that, and this is designed into GDPR, that we realize that we actually have control of our data, that we are licensing entitlement to organizations to use it in a responsible and pre-approved way. And if we don't like what's going on, we can get it back and keep it or give it to another provider. That's all designed into GDPR. And I think once the penny drops, I think it might take several years, but that's the direction of travel. That privacy is, according to the EU, a human right. And we just need to leverage it out of companies and take it back and get, I think once we have control of that, and once society recognizes as a whole that we have control of our data, then that might shift the needle and shift companies' response to that.
Go on. Go on.
Forgive me, and this might, coming from across the pond, the notion of privacy as a human right, and it's extremely foreign, and it might just be a matter of also coming from the technology side. Before I put my foot in my mouth and make it a sort of European versus American notion, the idea is unthinkable, at least on our end, anymore. And from the perspective of somebody in technology, it also feels, I don't want to use the term naive at the prospect of insulting, including people that, like, I have a great deal of respect. For example, a professor of mine, Luciano Floridi, has worked a great deal on this notion of sort of privacy and having control over the data. The problem is, we're thinking about the internet in a way that's still reliant on entities that we can face and that we're interacting with purposefully. So my issue is, so much focus is around companies like Google and Facebook that have a face and they're taxable entities and we can regulate them in a certain way. But in the process of connecting from where we're standing to Facebook, we've gone through 7 ad networks and the pipeline of an ISP that we don't know, and maybe it's gone through 7 different countries in the process. Our phone is also serving as ads, has a bunch of cookies, has a bunch of this information is being generated on us at every pit stop by a series of entities that we have never met, never agreed to do anything with, and will never be able to recall. So it becomes an interesting notion to put so much strain on the big companies that we're facing, while at the same time, there's all this information that's being collected in repositories that we're never gonna know.
And I find this idea, this sort of yo-yo effect, where you can pull your data back if you're not happy with it. I'm sort of intrigued as to how that would work. I mean, as a company, do you know where you've sent that user's data? Do you know everybody else who's got it? And if the user decides no more for you, can you not just give them back their data, delete it from your systems, but from everybody else that you gave it to in the course of your business? It seems insane to me.
Well, it might be insane. It's certainly difficult, but it's difficult based on
insanely difficult. Probably,
but it's difficult because we haven't built that in to the system. So we do share data. I mean, why would we not? And the answer is because it's not your data to share, or we treat it. Corporates treat it as their data. So GDPR is all about. I think there's a sense, certainly within the European, the broad European mindset, that the pendulum was too far towards the free sharing of data without any regard of it. And I think GDPR, if nothing else, will pull that pendulum back. Maybe not all the way to the other side, but somewhere in the middle. And I think some of the policies and processes of all businesses, big and small, have become out of kilter. And GDPR is about correcting that. Maybe not as far as some people in Europe would like to go, but certainly back from where we are at the moment. So, and that's why it's so hard. That's why it is painful. But it's designed to be painful, in a sense. It's designed to change behaviour because I think that it's got out of kilter.
Just aware we're coming to the end of our time, and we've got a fantastic panel here, and I'm keen to try and deliver to our audience as much free consultancy advice as I can wang their way. So I just wonder from each of you, just to wrap up.
I hope you're getting a cut.
10%, of course. From each of you, if you could narrow it down to the one thing that you think people should really zero in on to if they can start cracking this problem. If we start with Juan, is there one particular bit you'd say, look, get this sorted now?
You should have come back to me at the end.
We can start with
I'm so glad that you
you know what, again, to sort of pull it back from a lot of the things that we've been discussing into a realm that maybe I'm a little more comfortable with, but would also like to see a whole lot more development, particularly on the enterprise sector. There are those of us that are doing specialized research in order to provide intelligence that enterprises are just not ever going to be able to generate for themselves. You can't do herd protection if the only institution you ever get to see is yourself, or maybe not even yourselves. So don't try to replicate that effort by attempting to go extremely cutting edge technologically internally, but spend a whole lot more time on your processes and things that we've been discussing as far as, you know, how you're going to handle a data breach, how you're going to handle a communications failure, how you're going to handle all your endpoints going down. Those are great. At the same time, all of those issues come from not being able to handle not just an initial intrusion, but also somebody else essentially owning your network without you knowing it. So we would love to essentially be able to come in as researchers and security practitioners and have people already in place who have the right prerogative and have been empowered to do things with the information that we're going to provide them. And most enterprises essentially lack that at this time. So it would be great to see those processes come into vogue, to see that power already in that structure before we have to come in through the door and deliver some bad news.
Right, interesting. Rod?
I think from a communications perspective, a couple of things. First of all, communicate more internally and externally so that you're setting expectations better and people understand better where you're coming from. Also be understood by the regulators better, have relationships there. A lot of companies, only when they're in trouble do they look to make friends, and that of course is too late. So thinking ahead there. And I think another aspect of thinking ahead is also preparing through simulation exercises and those sorts of things. Maybe you didn't have a good one the other day, but you know, some of them can be very effective in at least testing processes and systems. You can do them in all sorts of ways. Obviously, I'm focusing on the communication side, so that you play through what would we do, down to those details of the tweet in response to something, you know, and make sure that you get those things right then, so that if you have to do it on the day, you get it right on the day too.
Fascinating, good stuff. Question from a CISO's perspective, but also...
Yeah, kind of what they said. So for me, I think I've really got on board with some of the recent talks lately of kind of people-centric security. And for me, it's kind of the heart of a good program. That whether it be in the kind of technical teams that are running the ones and zeros and the flashing lights to kind of analyse the intelligence, work the tools, but actually we forget about 90% of the organisation, the people that are living and breathing, making the products or delivering the service. And for me, if anything, if limited budget or kind of limited time to do something, I'll be focusing on my people and training and awareness that's right for them, right for their roles, to get them to understand what the threats are. I'll rely quite heavily on the technology to pick up a lot of the kind of, say, more sort of espionage type, more serious noise, the sort of bigger threats for us, but actually a lot of the day-to-day headache is dealt with by the teams on the front line.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I would say engage with the wider community. I mean, none of us are smart enough to imagine everything that could possibly happen. We are quite often constrained by our own imagination. And it's really only by engaging with a wider community that we get a sense of, geez, I hadn't ever thought of that. I need to add that to my program. So, you know, just engage with the community.
Fascinating stuff. Well, I think between Juan and Alessio and then the panel that we've got today, we've looked at that from about as 360 a point of view as you could get to. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, but I'd like to thank our panellists, Duncan, Christian, Rod and Juan, for their insightful and constructive comments. And thanks to you for joining us today. Meanwhile, from all of us here in London, goodbye.